Imagine arriving in Australia thinking you already understand how a normal country works. You know the language, you know the roads, you know what a supermarket looks like. You even recognize many of the things you see in movies. Then suddenly someone tells you that the tiny snack you packed in your suitcase could cause a serious problem at the border. Today we're counting down 10 Australian rules and regulations that can leave visitors scratching their heads. Some are about protecting the environment. Some protect Australia's unique wildlife. Others exist because Australians have decided that certain everyday behaviors need very clear boundaries and stay until the end. Because number 1 is one of those rules that can make a foreign visitor say, "Wait, you're serious?" Before we get into it, if you enjoy discovering the surprising side of Australia that tourists don't always see, hit the like button and subscribe. We're uncovering the everyday rules, habits, and cultural differences that make countries around the world completely different from what outsiders expect. Let's start with something that can surprise you before you even leave the airport. Australia takes biosecurity extremely seriously. Australia is an island continent that has developed an extraordinary collection of plants and animals, many of which exist nowhere else on Earth. That also means the country has a lot to lose if foreign pests, diseases, or invasive species enter the environment. So when you arrive, you may be asked whether you're carrying food, plants, seeds, animal products, soil, or other materials that could potentially introduce something dangerous. To a visitor, this can feel extreme. You might think it's just a piece of fruit. What's the big deal? But that's exactly the point. Something completely harmless in one country could carry an insect, fungus, bacteria, or disease that could cause enormous damage somewhere else. Australia's strict border controls aren't designed to make travelers miserable. They're designed to protect agriculture, ecosystems, and industries that can be damaged by invasive species. And this leads to an important lesson about Australia. A lot of Australian rules only sound ridiculous when you don't know the reason behind them. The second rule involves something Australians share their country with every day: wildlife. Australia is famous for kangaroos, koalas, wombats, crocodiles, and countless other unusual creatures. But because many of these animals are protected, you can't simply treat wild animals like property. You might see an adorable kangaroo and think, "I'm going to get close and feed it." That's where things can become complicated. Feeding wild animals can be prohibited or restricted in certain places because it can make animals dependent on humans, change their natural behavior, spread disease, or put both people and animals at risk. And there is another reason Australians can be very protective of wildlife. Some animals that look harmless can actually be dangerous when people get too close. A kangaroo may look like a giant friendly pet in a photograph, but it's still a wild animal. The same principle applies to crocodiles, snakes, and other wildlife. So one of the most important Australian rules for visitors is simple: admire wildlife, but don't assume it wants to be your friend. The third rule takes us from animals to something much more familiar: the road. Australia drives on the left side of the road, which is already enough to confuse visitors from countries that drive on the right. But Australia's road rules don't stop there. Speed limits are taken seriously, and enforcement can be strict. The fourth rule is one that surprises many visitors because it involves something people often consider completely harmless: littering. Australia has strict laws around littering, and penalties can apply depending on the state or territory and the type of offense. To a visitor, dropping something tiny might seem insignificant. But Australians generally have a strong expectation that public spaces should be kept clean. And once again, there's more behind the rule than simply making streets look nice. Trash can enter waterways, harm wildlife, damage beaches, and create hazards in public spaces. Imagine a plastic item being left on the ground. Rain washes it into a drain. The drain leads to a river. Eventually, it reaches the ocean. That tiny piece of litter can become part of a much bigger environmental problem. This is why Australia's approach to public cleanliness can sometimes feel stricter than what visitors are used to. The fifth rule is especially important if you're heading to one of Australia's famous beaches, national parks, or protected natural areas. You can't always take whatever you find. That beautiful shell on the beach might look like the perfect souvenir. That interesting rock might look great sitting on your desk. But in protected areas, removing natural objects can be prohibited or restricted. And this is where the Australian idea of leave no trace becomes important. The landscape isn't necessarily considered a collection of free souvenirs. It is part of an ecosystem. If thousands of visitors each take one shell, one rock, one plant, or one piece of natural material, the combined impact can become significant. So the rule that sounds like you can't even take this little shell home actually has a much bigger purpose. The sixth rule concerns national parks and protected areas. Visitors often assume that once they've paid an entrance fee, they can explore however they want. Not necessarily. Certain areas may be closed, certain paths may be restricted, and there can be strict rules about camping, fires, vehicles, fishing, pets, and interaction with wildlife. This can be surprising to someone who thinks a national park is basically a giant public playground. But Australia's natural environments can be incredibly fragile. Some areas contain plants and animals that are extremely sensitive to human activity. A visitor may think, I'm only walking a few meters off the path. But if thousands of people have the same idea, the vegetation can be destroyed surprisingly quickly. That's why you may see signs that seem almost overly specific. Stay on the path. Don't enter this area. Don't feed the animals. Don't light a fire here. Don't take natural objects. To a foreign visitor, it can feel like Australia has a rule for everything. But often those rules exist because someone already learned what happens when there aren't any. And now we reach number 7. This one can be especially surprising because Australia has some very serious rules concerning fire. Bushfires are a major environmental and safety concern in many parts of Australia, and restrictions on fires can change depending on local conditions. You can't simply assume that, because you're outdoors, you can light a campfire whenever you want. There may be designated areas where fires are permitted, and other areas where they are completely prohibited. During periods of high fire danger, restrictions can become much stricter. For a visitor, this might seem excessive. You're just trying to cook dinner. But in the wrong conditions, a small fire can become an enormous wildfire. Australia has seen devastating bushfires, so fire restrictions aren't treated as a minor inconvenience. They can literally be about protecting lives, homes, wildlife, and entire communities. This is one of those moments where an Australian rule suddenly makes perfect sense. The rule isn't really about stopping you from enjoying the outdoors. It's about making sure the next person can still enjoy that same landscape tomorrow. And that brings us to number 8. Australia also has rules surrounding pets and protected wildlife that can surprise visitors. In some areas, pets may be restricted from beaches, parks, nature reserves, or protected habitats. A dog owner might think, my dog is friendly, what's the problem? The problem is that wildlife doesn't necessarily understand the difference between a friendly pet and a predator. Even a well-behaved dog can chase birds, disturb nesting animals, or frighten wildlife. So in environmentally sensitive areas, restrictions can be surprisingly strict. And once again, the Australian approach often comes down to one principle. Humans aren't the only ones using the space. If you've been enjoying this, tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know which one sounds the strangest to you. And if this video made you see Australia a little differently, don't just leave without subscribing. Subscribe to now and see you in the next part.